The airport curb was empty except for me. I sat there in the wheelchair my son had folded out of his trunk 20 minutes earlier, a thin airline blanket over my knees that the wind kept trying to steal, and I watched his taillights shrink into the flow of departing cars until I couldn't tell his sedan from anyone else's anymore. He'd said he was going to park. He'd said it with his hand already on the gear shift, not looking at me. The way you say something you've rehearsed so many times it doesn't feel like a lie to you anymore. I'll circle back, Dad. Just wait right here. That was 40 minutes ago now. My phone showed 1 bar of signal and a battery that had dropped to 11%, because nobody had thought to hand me a charger, because nobody had thought I'd need one for longer than the length of a curbside. Goodbye. I want to tell you I was surprised. I wasn't, not really. Somewhere underneath the part of me that still wanted to believe my son was a decent man, there was another part. Quieter, older, the part that had spent 38 years reading the faces of teenage boys who were about to either tell me the truth or tell me what they thought I wanted to hear, and that part of me had known for weeks that something in my own house had gone wrong. I just hadn't wanted it to be this. A gate agent glanced at me twice through the sliding doors and then decided I wasn't her problem. A woman with 2 rolling suitcases stepped around my wheelchair without looking down. The way people step around a pothole, the autumn wind off the tarmac carried the smell of jet fuel and cut grass, and my hip, 3 months healed from surgery, still tender in weather like this, throbbed low and steady. A reminder that I was not built anymore for sitting exposed in the cold, waiting on a man who wasn't coming back. I was working up the nerve to wheel myself toward the terminal doors, toward some stranger who might let me use a real phone, when I heard the engines, not airport engines, something closer, heavier, coming off the access road at a speed that didn't belong in a passenger pickup lane. I turned my head and saw them, 2 black SUVs, windows tinted, moving in formation like they'd done it 1,000 times, cutting smoothly around the taxis and swinging in 10 feet from where I sat. For one long second, my stomach dropped the way it used to drop 40 years ago, back when black cars pulling up close and fast never meant anything good. Then the rear door of the first SUV opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, mid-30s, built like he still ran sprints for fun, sunglasses pushed up into short-cropped hair, and he looked at me sitting alone on that curb with my blanket sliding off my knees, and his whole face changed. Coach Doyle? I hadn't heard anyone call me that in 6 years. To understand how I ended up alone on a curb at the Dayton airport with 11% battery and a stranger in a suit staring at me like he'd seen a ghost, you have to go back 4 months, to the morning I woke up on a hospital gurney with a new titanium hip and a son standing over me who suddenly couldn't do enough for his old man. My name is Walter Doyle. I'm 71 years old. I coached cross-country and track at Fairview High School in Ohio for 38 years, and before that I ran 1.5 miles a day myself, every day, rain or shine, because that's what you do when running is the only thing that ever made sense to you. My wife Eleanor passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral, fast enough that I still sometimes reach for the other side of the bed before I remember. We'd been married 42 years. She used to say I fell in love with her the same way I fell in love with the sport, patiently, and then all at once. We had one son, Marcus, good boy once, quiet as a kid, always a little bit in his own head, the kind of runner who had real talent but never quite trusted it enough to push. I used to stand at the finish line and watch him ease off in the last 100 meters, every single time, like some part of him was afraid of what it would mean to actually win. I never pushed him to run competitively past high school. Eleanor said I should have pushed harder. Maybe she was right. What I know is that Marcus grew into a man who was always looking for the shortcut, the deal, the thing that would make the hard years unnecessary. He went through 2 business ventures before he was 40, a specialty coffee franchise that folded in 18 months, then some kind of consulting outfit that never seemed to have any actual clients. Each time, Eleanor and I helped where we could. Each time I told myself it was the last time. Then 3 years ago he married Cheryl. I want to be fair to her. I've turned this over 100 times since that curb. Tried to find the version of the story where she isn't the way I've come to understand her. But fair is not the same as blind, and I've stopped being blind. Cheryl is a sharp woman, I'll give her that. Real estate license, always in motion, always talking about positioning and leverage like she was still closing deals even at Sunday dinner. She was warm to me in the beginning, almost aggressively warm, remembered my coffee order, asked about my knee before I'd even mentioned it hurt, called me Walt within a week like we'd known each other 20 years. It took me longer than it should have to notice that her warmth always arrived right before a request. The hip replacement in June was supposed to be simple. 6 weeks of recovery, physical therapy twice a week, and I'd be back walking Eleanor's old trail loop by August. Marcus and Cheryl insisted I recover at their house instead of my own. You shouldn't be alone on those stairs, Dad, Cheryl said, and it sounded so reasonable that I packed a bag without arguing. Looking back, that was the first move on the board, and I didn't see it as one. The first 2 weeks were fine. Better than fine, almost. Marcus drove me to therapy. Cheryl made soup. My 6-year-old granddaughter, Poppy, would climb up next to my recliner and ask me to tell her again about the time I ran a marathon with a broken toe. I let myself believe, for those 2 weeks, that grief had finally softened something in my son, that maybe losing his mother had scared him into becoming the man she always hoped he'd be. Then, on a Tuesday morning, I remember, specifically because it was raining and my hip always aches worse in the rain, I came downstairs early for coffee and found Cheryl at the kitchen table with a laptop open and a folder of papers she closed a half-second too fast when she saw me. Insurance stuff, she said, smiling. Boring paperwork. You don't want to see it. She was right, I didn't want to see it. What I wanted, foolishly, was to trust her. It was Poppy who told me the truth, the way children always do, sideways, without meaning to. We were coloring at the kitchen table 2 weeks later, just the two of us, and out of nowhere she said, "Grandpa, are you going to live in Arizona now?" I set my crayon down very carefully. "Who told you that, sweetheart?" Mommy was on the phone. She said Grandpa's going somewhere nice with a pool, and it'll be easier for everyone. Poppy went back to her coloring like she hadn't just cracked something open in my chest. "Can I visit the pool?" I told her of course she could, and I kept my voice steady, and I finished coloring the horse she'd asked me to help with, and then I went up to the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with my hands folded, doing what I used to do with runners who'd just been cut from varsity, breathing through the first wave of it before deciding what came next. I didn't confront anyone that night. 38 years of coaching teenagers taught me one thing above all others. The moment you show a kid you already know the truth, they stop giving you any more of it. You let them keep talking. You watch what they do next. You gather. So I gathered. I started paying closer attention to the mail, which had begun arriving addressed strangely. A few pieces from a title company, one from a realty office 2 towns over, none of them opened in front of me, all of them disappearing into that folder Cheryl kept closing whenever I walked into a room. I started noticing that Marcus had stopped mentioning when my next physical therapy appointment was, even though he'd been the one driving me for weeks. I noticed Cheryl using the word eventually a lot, in sentences that used to be about my recovery and had quietly become about somewhere else entirely. Eventually, you'll want more support than we can give you here. Eventually, it'll just be easier, eventually. And I noticed, with the particular clarity that comes from having spent decades reading kids who thought they were being subtle, that my son could no longer look me in the eye for longer than a few seconds at a time. One night in early September, unable to sleep, hip aching, I did something I'm not proud of, and would do again without hesitation. I came downstairs at 2 in the morning for water and found Cheryl's laptop still open on the counter, unlocked, the way it always was because she trusted this house completely to be hers. I am not, by nature, a man who reads other people's private things. But I had a granddaughter who'd been told there was a pool waiting for me somewhere, and a son who couldn't meet my eyes, and 38 years of trusting my instincts about people who were hiding something. I sat down. I opened the folder on the desktop labeled, with a carelessness that told me they'd never expected me to look, simply Dad's house. Inside were listing photographs of my home, My house, the one Eleanor and I bought in 1987, the one where Marcus took his first steps in the front hallway, the one with her rose bushes still blooming along the side fence because I hadn't had the heart to stop watering them. Photographed, staged, priced, and listed for sale 11 days earlier, there was also a document. A power of attorney form. My name typed at the top. A signature at the bottom that was close enough to mine to fool a stranger, and not nearly close enough to fool a man who had 1,000 attendance sheets, and grade reports, and permission slips in his own handwriting for 40 years. I never signed that. I sat in that dark kitchen for a long time, the laptop's glow the only light in the room, my heart going in a way it hadn't gone since I was much younger, and I made myself do the thing I'd trained 1,000 17-year-olds to do at the worst moment of a race, the moment when your body wants to panic and your mind has to hold the line instead. I made myself breathe. I made myself think. And then I made myself close the laptop exactly the way I'd found it, and go back upstairs and lie in the dark until morning, giving nothing away, because I had just learned that my son and his wife believed they had already won, and a man who believes he has already won stops checking for the truth. I would need every hour of that head start. The plan, once I understood it, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Cheryl had a cousin, I'd learned this later, who ran an assisted transition service, which turned out to be a euphemism for a company that arranged one-way placements of elderly relatives into distant, understaffed care facilities, the kind that operated just far enough under the radar that families rarely followed up once the paperwork was signed. Arizona wasn't a lie, exactly. There was a facility there. What Poppy hadn't known, because 6-year-olds don't know how to read the fine print of cruelty, was that it wasn't a vacation. It was a door meant to close behind me. The house sale would clear the mortgage, my savings, and this was the part that told me everything about how far gone my son had let himself go. My 41 years of pension, all of it routed through a power of attorney I never signed. All of it meant to cover a business debt Marcus had never once mentioned to me. $210,000 owed to men who apparently did not extend grace periods. I found that number 3 days later buried in another folder. A collections notice with Marcus's name on it, and a due date that had already passed twice. I understood him a little better after that. Not forgave, understood. My son had spent his whole life terrified of being the man who failed, so afraid of it that when failure finally caught him, he decided it was easier to disappear his own father than to admit it out loud. Fear does that to people. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it explained it, and somewhere in me, the part that had once knelt beside 100 crying boys at the worst race of their young lives, I felt the whole shape of it, pity sitting right next to fury, neither one canceling the other out. I had 11 days before the flight Marcus had already booked. I spent them exactly the way he expected me to spend them. Quiet, cooperative, grateful for the soup and the rides to therapy, while I made 3 phone calls he never knew about. The first was to my old assistant coach and closest friend Ray Kowalski, retired Fairview PE teacher, 68 years old, built like a fire hydrant, married to my late wife's best friend, and the only man alive who still called me coach without a hint of irony. The second was to my attorney, a sharp young woman named Priya Nair, whom Eleanor had found for our estate planning years earlier, and who, when I explained what I'd found in that folder, went very quiet on the phone and then said, "Walter, I need you to send me everything you just told me, in writing right now, before you do anything else." The third call, I almost didn't make. I sat with the number in my hand for 2 full days before I dialed it, the number for a boy I hadn't spoken to directly in 11 years, though I'd followed his career from a careful distance, the way you follow anyone you helped raise without ever having the right to call it that. His name was Elias Cruz. He'd run for me for 4 years, 2006 through 2010, a scared, furious 15-year-old. The first day he showed up to practice in shoes 2 sizes too small because his mother was working 2 jobs and couldn't afford new ones before payday. I bought him proper running shoes out of my own pocket that week and told him it was a loan, so he wouldn't feel like charity, and he paid me back 4 years later, $11 a month, every month, until it was done, because that was the kind of stubborn, proud kid he was. I drove him to meets his mother's schedule couldn't cover. I sat with him at his kitchen table some Thursday nights, helping him fill out college applications neither of us fully understood. I stood behind him at his high school graduation because his father wasn't in the picture and somebody needed to be standing there. He didn't answer when I called. I left a voicemail, careful and calm, the way I'd learned to be careful and calm about everything now. Elias, it's Coach Doyle. I hope you're well. I could use some advice. If you ever have a spare minute. I didn't tell him what kind of advice. I didn't tell him about the folder, or the forged signature, or the flight. Some part of me, the proud part, the part that had spent a career telling boys not to feel sorry for themselves, didn't want to say it out loud to a former student, even one I'd once thought of as close to a son as anyone but Marcus. He never called back. 2 days passed, then 5. I told myself he was busy. I told myself it didn't matter, that Ray and Priya were enough, that I didn't need anyone else in my corner. I believed that, mostly, right up until the morning Marcus told me the specialist in Scottsdale had a cancellation, and could see me that same afternoon if we hurried, and helped me into the car with a gentleness that should have warned me more than it did, and drove me not to a hospital, but to the departures curb of the Dayton airport, where he unloaded a wheelchair and a single small suitcase I didn't recognize as mine, and told me he was going to park, and didn't come back. That's where you found me, where the story found me, sitting on that curb with a dying phone and a stranger's face suddenly going pale above me, a man in a dark suit stepping out of the first of 2 black SUVs, saying a name nobody had called me in 6 years, Coach Doyle. I looked up at him, at the earpiece curled behind his ear, at the second SUV's door already opening behind him, and for the first time in 11 days, I let myself feel something other than careful. Elias? My voice came out rougher than I meant it to. What in God's name are you doing here? He crouched down in front of my wheelchair so we were eye to eye, and behind the sunglasses I could see he was blinking too fast. The way you blink when you're trying not to let something show on your face in front of people who are watching you for a living. Working, he said. I'm running lead advance for the senator's arrival in 20 minutes. Then his jaw tightened, and the professional mask slipped just enough for me to see the boy underneath it. The one who used to run the last 100 meters like his life depended on it once I finally taught him to stop being afraid of winning. Coach, why are you sitting out here alone? Where's Marcus? I opened my mouth to answer him and found, for the first time in 11 days of careful silence, that I didn't have to be careful anymore. He said he was going to park, I told him, and even to my own ears it sounded thin, like an excuse I was still making for a boy I'd raised better than this. That was almost an hour ago now. Elias didn't say anything right away. He looked past me toward the terminal, toward the flow of taxis and shuttle buses, the way I'd once watched him scan a starting line for the runner he was most worried about. Then he looked back down at me, and something in his face had gone very still and very focused, the way it used to go still right before he found another gear nobody thought he had. Coach, how long has your phone been near dead? A while. And the suitcase, is that yours? I looked down at it, sitting there on the wheelchair's footrest, gray and unfamiliar. No, I said slowly, understanding it even as I said it out loud for the first time. No, it isn't. Elias stood up. He said something low into the small radio, clipped near his collar, words I didn't fully catch. And one of the other agents near the second SUV nodded and moved toward the terminal doors at a pace that wasn't quite a run, but wasn't far from it either. Then he crouched back down in front of me. I've got 4 minutes before I have to be exactly where I'm supposed to be, he said, and I am not leaving you on this curb. Marlowe, he tipped his head toward a younger agent standing near the first SUV, is going to sit with you. You're going to tell him everything, and when I'm off this detail in 90 minutes, I am coming straight back here, and we're going to figure out what just happened to you. You don't need to do that. You've got a job to coach. He said it the way he used to say it in the last 100 meters of a race, when I'd be running alongside the fence yelling his name, and it stopped me the same way it used to stop him. You bought me shoes with money you didn't have to spare, and you never once let me feel small about needing them. I am not walking away from you on an airport curb. That's not a conversation, that's just what's happening. He squeezed my shoulder once, hard, the way you squeeze a runner's shoulder at the line, and then he was gone, moving toward the arrivals area with the second SUV pulling into position behind him, and I was left there with a young agent named Marlowe, crouching down to my eye level, with a notepad already out, saying, "Mr. Doyle, why don't you start from the beginning?" So I did. Elias came back 2 hours later, out of the suit jacket now, tie loosened, looking less like a man running federal security and more like the exhausted 29-year-old he actually was. He'd brought coffee, mine black, the way I'd always taken it at 7 a.m. practices, which meant somewhere in the last 11 years he'd remembered that detail on purpose. He also brought a phone charger, a bottle of water, and a look on his face that told me Marlowe had already briefed him on everything I'd said. "I called my aunt," he said, pulling a folding chair up beside my wheelchair instead of standing over me. "She's a paralegal, does elder law mostly. I read her the broad strokes. She says what you're describing, the forged POA, the property listing, the one-way placement, that's not a family disagreement, coach. That's a crime. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, at minimum. Probably fraud on top of it." "I know," I said quietly. "I've known for 11 days. Then why are you still sitting on this curb being careful instead of already sitting in a lawyer's office?" It was a fair question, and I gave him the only honest answer I had. "Because he's my son, Elias. Because some part of me kept hoping I'd misread it. Because the last time I confronted someone I loved about something I already knew was true, I did it too fast, and it cost me a chance to understand why." Elias sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "You taught me patience wins races people think are already lost. You didn't teach me patience means letting somebody rob you blind while you wait for them to feel bad about it." I laughed. Despite everything, a short, surprise sound, the first laugh I'd managed in 11 days. "When did you get so mouthy? You want to know the truth? I learned it standing behind a certain cross-country coach who used to tell 17-year-olds exactly what they didn't want to hear, right when they needed to hear it." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "So here's what I don't want to hear you say. I don't want to hear you say you're going to go quiet again and hope it works out. I've got the afternoon. I've got resources most people don't. Let me use them." I thought about Eleanor then, the way I think about her at every crossroads I've faced since she died. What would she have told me to do? And I knew, the way I always know when I let myself actually listen for her, that she would have told me the same thing Elias was telling me now. "Stop protecting people who stop protecting you first." "All right," I said. "What do we do first?" What we did first was call Priya Nair, who arrived at the airport 40 minutes later in a rumpled blazer, having left a deposition early, carrying a legal pad already half full of notes from our earlier calls. What we did second was call Ray Kowalski, who showed up 20 minutes after that in his ancient pickup truck, having driven 90 miles over the speed limit the entire way, and who took one look at me, sitting there with a charger cord running to a wheelchair and a stranger's suitcase at my feet, and said, in the flattest voice I'd ever heard him use, "I'm going to kill him. I raised that boy's free throw percentage in 8th grade gym class, and I am going to kill him. You're not going to kill anybody, Ray. Fine. I'm going to yell at him very loudly in a way that feels like killing him." Priya was gentler, but no less clear. She sat with me in the airport's small quiet room, the one meant for nursing mothers in prayer, and she walked me through what she'd found in the 2 hours since my first frantic call. The property listing, still active, showing showings scheduled for that very weekend. The power of attorney document filed with the county recorder's office 9 days earlier, bearing a notarization from a notary public whose license, it turned out, had lapsed 8 months prior. Sloppy, she said. The kind of sloppy that happens when people are moving fast and counting on nobody looking closely. And, buried in a public records search, Elias's security team had run in 20 minutes flat with resources I didn't ask too many questions about. The collections notice for $210,000, filed against Marcus Doyle by a private lending group with an address that Priya's face told me she recognized before she said it out loud. "This isn't a bank loan, Walter," she said carefully. This is the kind of lender people go to when banks have already said no. I need you to understand what that might mean for how fast this situation was moving. I understood. I understood it the way you understand a fire alarm, abstractly, at first, and then all at once, viscerally, as the actual shape of the danger arrives. My son hadn't just been desperate. He'd been desperate enough to borrow from people who didn't extend grace periods, and desperate enough, when the bill came due, to decide that disappearing his own father into a facility 1,100 miles away was an acceptable price for making the problem go away. "What do?" I asked her, and I heard my own voice crack slightly on the word do, the first crack I'd allowed myself in 11 days. "First," Priya said, "we file for an emergency protective order and a formal revocation of that power of attorney, today, before end of business. Second, we get the property listing pulled and flag it as fraudulent to the title company before those showings this weekend go anywhere. Third," she paused, and looked at me with something gentler than a lawyer's usual efficiency. "Third, you decide how you want this to go, because I can make this quiet, a civil matter, papers filed, doors closed, or I can make it loud, and let the county prosecutor decide whether forging a POA and attempting to relocate a parent against his will while emptying his accounts is something they want to prosecute. Both paths are available to you. Only you get to choose which one." I sat with that question longer than I sat with almost anything else in this entire ordeal, because it wasn't really a legal question. It was a question about who I wanted to be, at 71 years old, alone in a wheelchair with a titanium hip and a dead wife and a son who'd tried to disappear me. Did I want to be the man who quietly protected his family's reputation one more time, the way I had for years, smoothing over Marcus's failures so the world never had to see them? Or did I want to be the man who finally let the truth stand in the daylight, whatever it cost? Because 11 days of careful silence had already cost me more than I could afford to keep paying. I thought of Poppy asking me about the pool. I thought of Eleanor's rose bushes, photographed and staged for strangers to walk through. "Loud," I said finally. "I want it loud enough that Cheryl's whole real estate office hears about it. I want it loud enough that whoever lent my son that money understands he doesn't have access to anything of mine to pay it back with. And I want it loud enough that when Poppy is old enough to understand what happened here, she hears the true version from people who were actually there, not whatever story gets told at Thanksgiving to make her parents look less like what they are." Priya nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer and respected it more for having waited to hear it from me instead of assuming it. "Then we're going to need somewhere to hold this conversation with Marcus and Cheryl that isn't private. Somewhere with witnesses who can't later be told they misunderstood what they saw." Ray cleared his throat from the doorway, where he'd been standing with his arms crossed like a bouncer at a bar that didn't need one. "Coach, 20th reunion for the 05 through 10 varsity squad is Saturday. Fairview High Gymnasium. You were supposed to be the guest of honor before all this. Half of Elias's old teammates are going to be there, plus half the town." He looked at me steadily. "Marcus already RSVP'd. Cheryl's catering it. Matter of fact, landed the contract through some connection or another. Whole town's going to be under one roof." I felt something settle in my chest, cold and clear. The particular calm that used to come over me at the start line of a big meet, when all the nerves finally organized themselves into focus. "Then that's where we do it," I said. "Saturday." Elias, who'd been quiet through most of this exchange, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, finally spoke. "I'll be there. Officially, I'm off duty by then, back for the reunion like everybody else." A small, humorless smile crossed his face. "Unofficially, I know some people who owe me favors, and I think it's time a few of them met your son." I didn't ask what he meant by that. I would find out on Saturday, along with everyone else. The 5 days between that airport curb and the reunion were the strangest of my life. Quiet on the surface, seismic underneath. Priya filed the emergency documents Thursday afternoon. The property listing came down from every platform by Friday morning, flagged as fraudulent. The title company's compliance officer apparently unhappy enough about the lapsed notary license that she called Priya directly to apologize for not catching it sooner. The power of attorney was formally revoked and refiled with the county, this time under my name, with my actual signature, witnessed by 3 separate people, none of whom needed to be told twice why the extra documentation mattered. I stayed with Ray and his wife those 5 nights, in the guest room of a house that smelled like sawdust and coffee, sleeping better than I had in months despite everything, because for the first time since Eleanor died, I wasn't alone with what I knew. Marcus called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. The first message was full of a manufactured worry that curdled halfway through into irritation. "Dad, where are you? The facility called and said you never checked in. This is exactly the kind of thing that worries me about you being on your own." As though he hadn't been the one to abandon me on a curb with a stranger's suitcase. The second message, left the following morning, had a different tone entirely. Tighter, more careful. And I understood without being told that somewhere in the last 24 hours he'd learned the listing had come down, that the notary's license had lapsed, that something in his careful plan had started coming apart at the seams before he expected it to. "Dad, call me back. We need to talk. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding with the paperwork." I didn't call back. I let him sit in whatever uncertainty he was sitting in, the same way he'd let me sit on that curb, not knowing whether anyone was coming for me at all. Cheryl didn't call once. I noted that the way you note the absence of a sound you'd expected to hear, the dog that didn't bark. Whatever she'd already understood about how quickly this was unraveling, she'd apparently decided that reaching out to me directly wasn't a risk worth taking. Poppy called, though, or rather, Poppy got hold of Marcus's phone for 30 seconds on Thursday evening and left me a voicemail entirely on her own initiative, her small voice serious and businesslike in the way only 6-year-olds can manage. "Grandpa, it's Poppy. I hope you like the pool. Can you send me a picture of it? Also, I lost a tooth. Bye." I listened to that message 11 times over the course of those 5 days. Each time, it made the choice I'd made a little easier to carry. Because whatever else happened Saturday, whatever it cost Marcus and Cheryl, it would not cost Poppy the truth. She deserved better than growing up believing her grandfather simply chose, one ordinary Tuesday, to leave. Friday night, Ray and I sat on his back porch with 2 glasses of the bourbon. Eleanor always used to say I drank too rarely to actually enjoy properly, and he asked me the question I could tell he'd been sitting on all week. "You scared for tomorrow?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "No," I said finally. "I coached 38 years of teenagers through the worst race of their young lives. I know how to stand at a finish line and tell somebody the truth about what just happened, win or lose." I turned my glass slowly in my hand, watching the porch light catch the amber of it. What scares me isn't tomorrow. What scares me is that I raised a boy who thought disappearing his own father was an easier conversation to have than telling him the truth. That's the part I don't know how to fix with paperwork. Ray didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. Some wounds don't come with a remedy, only with the long, unglamorous work of deciding what you're going to do with them. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Ray said finally, "you're not walking into that gym alone. You remember that?" I did remember it. I remembered it Saturday morning, too, getting dressed in a borrowed dress shirt Ray's wife had ironed for me, my hip aching in the particular way it always did before a long day on my feet. Or, now, a long day in a wheelchair I was still learning to make peace with, and I remembered it most of all when Ray's truck pulled into the Fairview High parking lot that evening, and I saw, gathered there under the gymnasium lights waiting for me, more of my old runners than I'd seen in one place in over a decade, Elias Cruz standing at the center of them like he'd never left, and beyond them, unaware yet of exactly what kind of evening they'd walked into, my son and his wife, smiling for the caterers, completely certain that whatever had gone wrong with their plan this week, it was still a problem they could smooth over with enough charm and enough time. They had no idea how little of either they were about to have left. The Fairview High Gymnasium hadn't changed much in the years since I'd last coached from its sidelines. Same scuffed hardwood, same championship banners hanging crooked from the rafters, same smell of floor wax and popcorn that never quite left a building like that no matter how many decades passed. Somebody had strung up twinkle lights along the bleachers and set up round tables with white cloths for the reunion dinner, and at the center of it all, near a table stacked with catering trays, stood Cheryl in a cream-colored dress, directing two servers with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had landed exactly the kind of visible, prestigious contract she'd always wanted. I watched Marcus spot me from across the gym the moment Ray wheeled me through the double doors. I watched the color leave his face in stages, first confusion, because as far as he knew I was supposed to be 1,000 miles away settling into a facility with a pool, then something closer to panic, when his eyes moved from me to the crowd gathering around me, to Elias Cruz standing at my shoulder in a suit that fit him considerably better than the one he'd been wearing at the airport. And finally, when he saw Priya Nair approaching from the far end of the gym, with a folder under her arm, and her expression set in the particular calm of a lawyer who has already won, and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up with the truth. Something that looked very much like the beginning of understanding. He crossed the gym floor toward me fast, weaving between tables, his voice already pitched low and urgent by the time he reached me. "Dad, what are you doing here? How did you even—" He stopped himself, glanced at the crowd around us, and dropped his voice further. "Can we talk somewhere private?" "No," I said. The single word landed harder than I expected it to, and I watched it land on him. Watched something in his face flinch the way it used to flinch as a teenager, when he knew he'd been caught in something and hadn't yet worked out how much I actually knew. "Dad, please. Whatever you think happened." "I don't think anything happened, Marcus. I know exactly what happened, because I was there for it. You drove me to that curb yourself." My voice was steady. The same voice I'd used at 100 finish lines to tell a boy something he didn't want to hear. Calm, because calm cuts deeper than anger ever does. "You told me you were going to park." By now, people nearby had started to notice. Old runners drifting closer under the pretense of saying hello to their former coach. Conversations at nearby tables trailing off. I saw Cheryl's head come up sharply across the room. Saw her register the shape of what was happening. Saw her start moving toward us with a smile already assembling itself on her face. The same practiced warmth she'd greeted me with the very first week I'd moved into their guest room. "Walt," she said, arriving at my shoulder, resting a hand lightly on the back of my wheelchair like she had every right to it. "You look wonderful. We were so worried about you." The facility called and said you never checked in, and we had no idea what— Cheryl. Priya's voice, arriving from behind her, quiet and level, cut through the sentence like a blade through fabric. "I'm going to need you to step back from Mr. Doyle's chair." Cheryl turned, and I watched the recognition hit her. The folder in Priya's hands, the badge visible at Elias's belt where his suit jacket had shifted, the sudden gathering silence of 24 former athletes who'd all, without quite planning to, formed a loose half-circle around the small drama unfolding at its center. I watched her calculate fast, the way I imagined she calculated everything, weighing whether charm could still carry this, or whether the moment for charm had already passed. "I don't know what this is," she said, "but I don't appreciate." "This," Priya said, opening the folder, "is a formal notice of fraud regarding a power of attorney filed under Walter Doyle's name 9 days ago, which he did not sign, notarized by a public notary whose license had lapsed 8 months prior. This is a fraudulent property listing for his home, which has since been removed and referred to the county for investigation. And this," she held up a single page, not close enough for anyone to read but close enough for its shape to register, "is a collections notice for $210,000 filed against Marcus Doyle, dated 3 weeks before this reunion was even scheduled." The gymnasium had gone very quiet. Somewhere behind me I heard Ray mutter something under his breath that sounded a great deal like I told you I was going to yell at him, and felt his hand settle heavy and steady on my shoulder instead, holding that anger in check the way he'd always held his own temper in check on the sidelines when a referee made a call he didn't like. Marcus's face had gone gray. "This isn't— Dad, I can explain. It wasn't supposed to go like this. I was going to fix it before you even knew, I swear to you." "You were going to fix it," I repeated, and something in me, some last careful reserve I'd been holding on to all week, finally let go. Marcus, you left me on a curb. You gave me a suitcase that wasn't mine and a one-way ticket to a place I'd never agreed to go, and you told me you were going to park the car. I panicked. I owed money to people who don't. Dad, you don't understand what kind of people I was dealing with. They weren't going to wait. And Cheryl said, if we could just get the house sold before you found out, we'd have time to pay it back and put everything back the way it was, and you'd never even have to. I'd never have to know. I finished for him that my own son decided disappearing me was easier than telling me the truth. I let that sit in the silence of the gymnasium for a long moment before I continued, and when I spoke again, my voice had dropped, not in volume, but in something harder to name, the particular quiet of a man who has finally stopped protecting someone who never once protected him. I coached kids for 38 years, Marcus. Do you know what I always told them? Every single one, the ones who choked at the finish line and the ones who cheated on a rep count and thought I hadn't noticed. I told them the lie is never actually about the mistake. It's about what you think of the person you're lying to. You didn't think I could handle the truth about your debt. You didn't think I'd forgive you for needing help. So instead you decided I was worth less to you than $210,000 and the trouble of one honest conversation. Cheryl's composure finally cracked, all at once, the practiced smile collapsing into something thinner and more desperate. You don't understand what it's like, watching him fall apart over money he can't pay back. I did what I had to do to protect this family. You forged my signature, I said, turning to her directly for the first time. There is no version of protecting a family that runs through forging an old man's name on a document that would have handed his own house to strangers while he sat in a facility 1,000 miles away, wondering why nobody had called. Nobody in that gymnasium spoke. I could feel 24 former runners watching this unfold, people who had grown up under my whistle, who had trusted me with the worst moments of their teenage years. Watching now as the family I'd built after most of them left home came apart in real time, under the twinkle lights of a reunion banquet. It was Elias who broke the silence, and when he did, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had spent the last week making very careful use of exactly the kind of resources most people don't have. Marcus. He stepped forward, close enough that Marcus had to look up at him. I made a few calls this week. The lending group you borrowed from, the one sending you collections notices, has a file with the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Unit going back 3 years. You're not their first desperate borrower. And elder fraud connected to loan shark debt is exactly the kind of case that unit has been building toward for a while now. He let that land before continuing. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you because your father spent 4 years making sure I understood. There's always a harder, better path available, even when the easy one looks like the only door left open. You have one now, too. It's called telling the truth, cooperating with the investigation Priya's about to open, and finding out whether the people who love you can find their way back to trusting you again. It won't be fast. But it exists. Marcus stood there, gray-faced, silent, looking for the first time in longer than I could remember, like the quiet, uncertain boy I remembered from the back of the pack in his sophomore year, the one who used to ease off in the last 100 meters because some part of him had never believed he deserved to win. Dad, he said finally, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that, despite everything, still reached something in me I hadn't managed to fully close off. I'm sorry. I don't know how I let it get this far. I know, I said, and I meant it, though I was careful, even now, even here, not to let it mean forgiveness. Because forgiveness and understanding are not the same country, no matter how close their borders sit. But sorry isn't the finish line, Marcus. It's the starting gun. What you do in the next mile is what's actually going to tell me who you are. I nodded once to Priya, who stepped forward with the papers Marcus and Cheryl would need to sign that week. A formal repayment agreement for what remained recoverable, cooperation with the fraud investigation already underway, and terms, carefully drafted, for any future contact with Poppy that put her well-being ahead of either of her parents' comfort. Cheryl's face, watching those papers appear, had gone from desperate to something colder and more calculating. Already, I suspected, working out which parts of this story she could still control the telling of. I understood, watching her, that whatever came next for their marriage was not mine to referee. The gym stayed quiet around us for a long moment. Then, from somewhere near the back, one of my old runners, a woman named Danielle, who'd run the 800 for me back in 2003, now in her late 30s with 2 kids of her own in the crowd, stepped forward and said, simply, "Coach, we've got you. Whatever you need." And then, the way a crowd sometimes does when it finally exhales all at once, the gymnasium came back to life around us, quiet conversations resuming at a respectful distance, old teammates drifting closer to offer a hand on my shoulder or a quiet word, the reunion reassembling itself imperfectly around the wreckage of what had just happened at its center. The way life always does, whether you're ready for it or not. The private reckoning came 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, in the kitchen of the house Eleanor and I had bought in 1987, the house that was, by then, safely mine again, the fraudulent listing scrubbed from every platform, the forged power of attorney formally voided by the county, the rose bushes along the side fence still blooming stubborn and unbothered by everything that had nearly happened to them. Marcus came alone. Cheryl, I'd learn later, had moved out of their house 2 weeks earlier, and back to her sister's, the marriage another casualty of a scheme that had cost far more than the debt it was meant to solve. He sat across from me at the same kitchen table where Eleanor used to grade his spelling tests 40 years earlier, and for a long time neither of us said anything at all. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the table between us. A small silver whistle on a worn leather cord, the one I'd worn around my neck at every practice for 38 years, the one that had gone missing from my nightstand sometime during those 11 strange days, and that I'd assumed in all the chaos was simply lost. "I took it," he said quietly, "the day you had surgery, before we even brought you to our house. I don't fully know why. I think I wanted something of yours that I couldn't sell or lose or ruin, something that would still be exactly what it was no matter what I did." He pushed it across the table toward me. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for the rest of it by giving this back. I just needed you to have it again." I picked it up, felt the familiar worn groove of it against my palm. 4 decades of practices and meets and quiet mornings folded into one small piece of silver, and I thought about all the boys I'd taught to run the last 100 meters like they believed they deserved to win, and how strange it was that the hardest lesson had turned out to be one I still had to teach my own son, at 71, from a wheelchair, in the kitchen where his mother used to sit. "Elias told me something at the reunion," I said finally. "He said sorry isn't the finish line, it's the starting gun." I set the whistle down on the table between us, not pocketing it yet, leaving it there, deliberately, in the space we still had to cross together. "I believe that. I don't know yet whether you're capable of running the distance that comes after it, but I'm willing to stand at the start line with you and find out, the same way I stood at 100 start lines with 100 scared kids who didn't believe in themselves yet." Marcus's eyes filled, and this time he didn't try to hide it. "What does that look like? Practically, I mean. What do you need from me?" "The truth, first and always, even when it's ugly. Actual repayment, not promises. Priya will hold you to the schedule whether I want to or not, and honestly, I'm grateful for that. Because I don't trust myself yet to be the only one keeping you honest." I paused, watching him carefully, and time with Poppy, supervised for now, so she can see her father showing up consistently instead of showing up big and disappearing. Little things, over and over, for a long while, not one grand gesture. I've coached enough kids to know that character isn't built in a single race. It's built in every practice nobody's watching. He nodded slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand, looking for a moment almost young again. "I can do that. I want to do that." "Then do it," I said. "Not for me, for her." We sat there a while longer, not saying much else, the kitchen filling with the particular gold light of a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, Eleanor's rose bushes visible through the window over the sink. Still blooming, still stubborn, still exactly where she'd planted them. 6 months later, I stood at the edge of the Fairview High track on a cool October morning, off the wheelchair now, Walking with a cane I still needed some days and didn't need on others. Watching Poppy run her very first 50-yard dash in a youth track meet, her small legs pumping with a fierce, uncomplicated joy that made something in my chest ache in the good way, the way pride is supposed to ache. Marcus stood beside me, phone in his pocket instead of in his hand, actually watching, actually present 6 months of small, consistent things finally beginning to add up to something that looked, from a distance, almost like trust rebuilding. "She's fast," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Not the careful performance of a man managing an audience, but simple, unguarded fatherly pride. "She eases up in the last 10 yards, I said, watching her. "Just like you used to." He laughed, surprised, and then went quiet, watching his daughter cross the finish line 4th out of 6, grinning ear to ear anyway, utterly unbothered by where she'd placed. "Think she'll ever stop doing that?" he asked. "Easing up at the end?" I thought about that question longer than it probably warranted, watching Poppy run back toward us, arms already open, whistle still hanging around my own neck now where it belonged, worn smooth by 4 more decades of use than the day Marcus had first taken it, and finally understood, better late than never, exactly what it meant to give something back. "Only if somebody keeps standing at the finish line," I said, telling her she's allowed to want it. Poppy reached us and threw her arms around my waist, breathless and beaming, and over the top of her head, Marcus and I looked at each other for a long moment. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet fully, but something adjacent to it, something patient and still under construction, the way the best things usually are. The porch light back at the house was on. When we got home that evening, the way I'd started leaving it on every night since the reunion. Not for Eleanor this time, though I still thought of her every time I flipped the switch, but for whoever might still need to find their way back. You never really stop coaching. I've learned. You just spend the second half of your life running alongside people slower than you'd like, at a pace that frustrates you sometimes, believing, because the alternative is unbearable, that somewhere up ahead, if you're patient enough, they'll finally find their own last gear.